I'm delighted this morning as we sort of shift our focus from what happened and what was to where we are and where we're headed, to be able to introduce to you a colleague and friend, John Seeley Brown. John is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Southern California, but previously he was the chief scientist of Xerox Corporation and director of the Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, which is famous for, as you know, for its innovations in our field. He held that position for nearly 2 decades. His personal research interests include the impact of globalization on business, the management of radical innovation, digital culture, ubiquitous computing, and organizational and individual learning. He's a member of the National Academy of Education, a fellow of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence, of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a trustee of Brown University and the MacArthur Foundation. His most recent book, The Only Sustainable Edge, co-authored with John Hagel, is about new forms of collaborative innovation. It also provides a novel framework for understanding what's really happening to offshoring and how each country is inventing powerful new ways to innovate, learn, and accelerate capability building. He received his bachelor's in mathematics and physics from Brown and a PhD from the University of Michigan, and he comes and visits us in Ann Arbor from time to time, and we always treasure those visits. He's going to talk to us this morning about how all this work that we did is going to impact and is impacting the way people learn and grow intellectually. John?
Thank you. Good morning. It was such a delight to be here yesterday. I want to build off of much of what was happening in the room here. Because think about it. This room was filled with the pioneers. This room was filled, it still is, with the people that actually had fire in their belly, a belief in what could be done, and a passion to make a difference. One of the questions we all face is how do we reignite and rekindle much of that passion in today's kids? Are today's kids much like we actually were back then? I want to come back to that topic in various ways, but I think this is something that I think has been haunting a lot of us. And it came into focus yesterday to think of the kinds of visionary work, the kinds of tinkering as well that went on to make the NSFNET, the net itself, actually come alive. So the subject of this little talk this morning is not really a talk, it's a set of kind of evocative images, more as a set of idea sparkers. I want to call it Minds on Fire. How might learning in the net age rekindle the kind of passion that this room has and had to kind of create the innovation, the systemic innovations that we now live by and take for granted? Mark yesterday hinted at potentially a very interesting transformation. If you really think about the 20th century, most of our schooling actually was focused on, if you wish, learning about a field. And then after you kind of study a field in terms of learning about it, in terms of the facts, the concepts, the theorems, and so on and so forth, after maybe 4 years of college, 2 years of graduate school, you start to be able to participate in learning what does it mean to be a physicist, a research mathematician, an engineer, and so on and so forth. In fact, learning about has to do with the explicit knowledge. Learning to be is something that happens in practice, through practice, in terms of the kind of tacit structures that actually make most of the difference. Now think about it a moment. I don't know about you, but I was actually trained at Michigan as a research mathematician, and it was not until my second year of graduate school, by mistake, Paul Helmos, a brilliant research mathematician, got stumped at the board. And for the first time in 6 years of studying mathematics, I began to see what it would mean to be a research mathematician. I had learned a huge amount about mathematics, but not how to really be and to think, the sensibilities, the sense of elegance, and so on and so forth, that characterize a particular epistemic culture, if you wish. What I want to argue is that we're now set, because of the net age, to think about a complete inversion of this. What might it mean to actually, in the 21st century, reverse this game and start out much more about learning to be, and then to be able to have that learning to be in terms of doing real things and even tinkering, you get stuck. And when you get stuck, then you engage in productive inquiry and you start to learn more about it. So how do you actually invert this thing and kind of wind it in terms of learning to be, learning about, learning to be, learning about, and kind of bring this to the fore much, much earlier? And how might the net actually facilitate this? So let's start a small story. One of the most dramatic examples, which never gets talked about very much, Moses. Think about the fact that in about 1978, a major effort was undertaken to jumpstart a nation, to educate a nation in terms of VLSI design. And in a very small number of years, the university system and the college system of the United States produced 10 to 20,000 engineers that had actually experienced what it mean to be a designer in VLSI design. This, I claim, actually gave the United States its competitive edge, which basically we've been able to maintain in the VLSI arena ever since. Moses started with a multi-project chip project, MPC, which actually enabled students to be able to pack multiple projects, their projects on one chip, send it off to a foundry, get that back a month later, and so on. And they started to be able to learn how to design. But this was triggered not just by this kind of use of a net to be able to submit your designs to a foundry, but rather it was also facilitated and scaffolded, if you wish, by a brilliant book by Carver Mead and Lynn Conway that invented a new set of very simple design rules that let you start early designing something without having to learn all the atomic physics and so on and so forth behind how chips actually work. Yes, there was a small compromise, but basically that changed the game. If you were willing to design with maybe a 10% compromise in performance, the world or the nation actually could start to experiment and tinker with VLSI design. And in fact, you might say, very much in the spirit of the net and much in the spirit of yesterday, what we really had here was a way for the community to bootstrap itself, because we learned with and from each other. We looked at each other's chips. Your designs were open, more or less, especially at the university level, and so on and so forth. Notice that this was followed up today by Bob Kahn, Keith Unkefer, taking those same ideas into basically the MEMS, microelectrical mechanical systems in the nano world in terms of a new type of foundry. But this foundry was more dedicated to jump-starting the ability of small companies and larger companies to be able to experiment with MEMS and nanotechnologies. This was not using the same fab lines, because basically in the MEMS world, you don't have simple design rules. You often have to have a much greater control over the processes, and basically you build MEMS and nanotechnology much more like a job shop and much just like a fab line. So this never had quite the same educational impact, but I think we should never forget what I think Moses really did for us, every one of us in this room. I want to claim something very simple. The net facilitates many forms of learning to be. In fact, I want to argue that maybe for the first time in the 21st century, we actually have a new way to think about learning, much more like Dewey thought about in 1930, but now we have the tools, the infrastructure to be able to bring alive a whole new form of learning that I think really does rekindle the passion that we kind of feel missing in much of our school system today. So let's look at some examples of learning to be that has been facilitated by the net. Maybe the simplest example is open source. I mean, open source may have 1 million people now joining these different communities of practice. And you start to learn, in order to join a community of practice, the practices, the sensibilities, the senses of elegance, and so on and so forth, that each of these communities of practice actually instills implicitly, tacitly, in terms of the ways they go about doing things. In fact, the open source community can be characterized very simply by a desire to write code to be read by others. Because in this world, in the open source world, you're trying to learn with and from each other and create with and from each other. And in fact, you build social capital, as we all know here, by actually making significant introductions and capability additions to the open source platform, where I think it's interesting now that the notion of reputation was kind of the main form of capital that underlies a good share of this. But we usually think about open source as a new form of production. I suggest that maybe the real thing that's happening here is that open source communities is actually a new form of distributed cognitive apprenticeship. These kids are apprenticing by joining a particular community of practice and picking up tremendous sets of practices through that same process of joining a particular Apache, Linux, and so on and so forth community. The mantra, open code, open systems, open community discussion, a little bit like RFC as another kind of learning mechanism. But let's jump ahead. There are many other examples that the net has enabled and is continuing to enable. Consider the Falks Telescope project. This is a moderately serious telescope. It happens to be this particular one on Maui. There are two of them, one in the southern, one in the northern hemisphere. Ironically, this telescope, although situated in Maui, is paid for and run by England. In fact, any English student can actually get access, same with Australia today, to this telescope. This telescope is completely robotically controlled, and you run these experiments remotely. But very much like open source, and very much like this fundamental notion of learning to be, you're not isolated here. You may run an experiment, but to use this system, you have to agree that everything you do has to be put back up on the net in open source. And the community at large gets to see what you did with it. Professional astronomers come in and look over what some of the experiments were, can comment, and so on and so forth. In fact, you might actually say this was the beginning of kind of the rise of the pro-amateur, where professionals and amateurs start to interact in very interesting ways. And think about amateur. Amateur to most of us is a negative term. But if you go back to the etymology of amateur, amateur comes from the Latin word amator. Amateur meaning things you do for love. Amateurs do things for love. Technically speaking, professionals do things for money, amateurs do things for love. But what's interesting here is how professionals, well-trained, start to interact with amateurs as a new form of implicit learning type platform, beautifully illustrated by this platform. And even there's now a Falks Academy built around this to really facilitate more and more of these types of interactions between the professional astronomers and the amateur astronomers. But it doesn't stop there. Here is a MicroObserver Network. There are 5 of these telescopes. These are more minor telescopes, although they have extremely good CCD sensors built into them that are basically liquid cooled, so there's almost no noise on these. And anyone in this country, anyone in the world, can sign up for making observations on one of these machines. In fact, last night was the only night this entire week that I have not grabbed a few minutes of time on one of these telescopes to make a set of observations. Any of us can do it. Those are, again, opened up for anybody else to observe what you're doing, your analyses of what's going on, and so on and so forth. This has really made possible a sense of empowering the amateurs of the country to start tinkering in brand new ways. But we'll come back to that. Here, for example, is a very interesting set of images that a high school student made of the Lagoon Nebula, one of the 2 nebulas that are more or less visible by the human eye in the northern hemisphere. But can you imagine the excitement of being able to take this kind of a photograph, process it through a whole bunch of digital signal processing algorithms and so on, where the image starts to really come out, and then be able to put that back on the net, show your friends, and so on and so forth. This applies to anyone in the country that wants to do it. Fortunately, even those of us that are in the ancient generation that have semi-retired can now actually go back and do this kind of stuff, which was basically impossible until fairly recently. Another example. Today's kids love biology. They love the animal world. Here is a pretty serious electron microscope put on the net that high school teachers and students can submit samples to and then run their own experiments. This is, again, robotically controlled electron microscope that you actually start to experience the practices of running one of these scopes and see what it takes to make interesting observations. Good, I'm glad you're putting the images up here, not me. The image on the right here is this very surprising image. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. This is, in fact, the ends of the particles or the tentacles of a gecko. And each one of these little fragments you see here, filaments you see here, is less than the wavelength of visible light. It is that small. This works by van der Waals forces. And it's through the van der Waals forces in terms of when they hit a contact, which makes this gecko able to zoom up a room, zoom up a wall, so on and so forth. Here are the types of images that students can now create remotely by running these electron microscopes themselves. Most campuses, no high school I know of, has such a system, but of course the net has enabled this to be accessible by virtually anybody. I can't begin to describe the excitement of certain types of students when they actually can begin to probe something as mysterious as how does the gecko actually work? In fact, not only is this exciting to students, it is also very exciting to DARPA, because they would love to be able to build things that run up walls as fast as a gecko does. Here is an example of one of the geckos. They're strange beasts. Finally, let me just kind of draw attention on ILabs, which is, again, taking a whole set of kind of instrumentation at MIT and put this accessible on the net. The image at the bottom on the left here has to do with heat exchangers. Now students anywhere in the world can run certain types of experiments on these heat exchangers, which are, again, fairly complicated to be able to have this kind of equipment that can measure this kind of thing in your own particular home setting or even university. So MIT has decided to kind of open up this whole space through this notion of ILab, through remote running of these test equipments, et cetera, very much in the spirit of what happened 20 years, 30 years earlier with Moses. And of course, one of the best examples that I know of is NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research, that has agreed through NSF to be able to open up a certain percentage of the time on their supercomputers through an outreach program where our high school students can now actually get in and start tinkering with climate models to see what is possible, what are the parameters like, how kind of stable are some of these vortices in a tornado, et cetera. But this is not limited just to the e-sciences. Science is done over the net. The humanities, likewise, is jumped on this game. Let me just give you briefly two examples. This is the Decameron website. This is a site of one particular spike, you might call it, in scholarship. This is where all the world's scholars get together and put their ideas together and their writings and their samples around the Decameron novel. This had to do with a novel, what happened with the Black Plague in Florence, when everybody left Florence to the hills, and how they entertained themselves. This is a major form of study, scholarship in Italian literature today. And what I find so interesting about this example is what's really happening here is that now undergraduates and graduates participate on this website and for the first time begin to get kind of exposure to what scholarship is really like at a very early age in terms of Italian literature. Because you partake in the types of scholarship debates, you partake in some of the peer reviews. The peer reviews are done openly on this particular type of system, and so on and so forth. So you get a little of a window into the practices of a certain type of scholarship. Another example is the Valley of the Shadows, looking at all the documents just prior, during, and after the Civil War along the Mason-Dixon line, to just see how two communities very close to each other geographically, opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the Civil War saw what was going on. What a wonderful way to get some sense of different ways to listen to what is actually being said. You get all the original documents, and from that you can go in and explore as much as you want in these resource rooms and so on. But let's step back. What is the bigger picture here? Well, one aspect of this is life in the net age actually has become a culture of participation. Participation. Life of tinkering, building, remixing, and sharing. No longer is there any kind of clear break between producing and consuming. And in fact, in a very interesting way, if you talk to today's digital kids, if you ask what creates meaning for them, meaning is created to a very large extent in terms of what they build, what they share, and what other kids build on what they have done. Through a kind of a notion of Creative Commons license, etc., attribution stays with the original product, but basically this cycle starts to develop. And so I build, other people build on what I do, it comes back to me, it cycles through again and again. So in a curious way, for these kids, meaning is created to a large extent in terms of what they have created and others have taken up and built on. This is the beginning of a kind of a new form that basically was so obvious to everyone in this room 20 years ago. I think left this country, and we'll come back to that in a moment, and we see that the net is now enabling this to come back, often in very simple ways in terms of the remix of music, remix of images, remixes of video, and so on and so forth. But guess what? Maybe something much deeper is happening here at the same time. Let's face it, starting around 1980, tinkering kind of left. Almost everyone in this room, I'm going to argue, actually was a tinkerer in one way or another, electronics, mechanic systems, and so on and so forth. We didn't learn deep things, but we did learn how to do certain things. We actually learned a little bit about how to be an effective tinkerer, and from that being, we actually start to build an intuition, which served, which served as a beautiful basis for learning about things after the fact. That kind of platform of building intuition is what enabled us to kind of pick up new things with confidence and be able to tinker with them as ideas and then tinker with them in the physical world. But around 1980, tinkering stopped. Everything became cognitively impenetrable. You can't open up your watch and figure out what's going on. If you happen to be in California, as a couple of us are in this room, you're not even allowed to tinker with your cars anymore. Believe me, I know. So tinkering kind of left. But I want to argue that, in fact, tinkering is back, starting around 1995, originally having to do with how do you tinker with media of various forms, already suggested, but maybe more importantly now, like with the gecko over here, over there. Basically, tinkering can now go below the surface. So maybe you can't look at a particular chip, but you may actually be able to actually look at atomic physics in brand new ways, or you can go above this whole system in terms of the kind of how the cosmos works. So tinkering has now come back, not only in the media world, which is the press covers, but I think in all kinds of other ways made possible by this kind of notion of access to remote instrumentation and communities that have been built around these types of tools to work with each other. Let's think about this a moment. We all know about the long tail and the age of abundance. Chris Anderson made this very famous. Think about how the long tail applies in education. A little bit depressing fact, but worth a moment of reflection, that in fact, the cost structure in education fits the long tail. That is to say, about 20% of the courses bring in about 80% of the revenue. And 80% of the cost actually goes to satisfying the thin part of this tail. And of course, think about progress going through a university system. You start in the fat part of the tail, and then you migrate down further and further and further into the specialties. And the more specialized you get, often the more costly that particular research seminar is, and so on and so forth. So the long tail does apply to education. And in fact, if you really want to think about how we're going to make education more cost-effective, we may want to think about the dynamics of this long tail. And indeed, I want to suggest we may want to invert the entire scheme again. And let's think about it not as a long tail in education, but the long tail in learning. And ask the simple question, what about what happens when, for example, in any of the examples I just gave, you find a niche community of practice that you join. And in that niche community, you start to experiment with things. You start, in fact, learning by being, almost always driven by a passionate interest that you have. Then you get stuck. And when you get stuck, you start moving up in terms of productive inquiry to learn more about something. So maybe we have this whole scheme inverted, but now possibly with the net, we may have the ability to be able to access kind of these infinite number of very niche communities of practice in the long tail, and then move from there up to learning more about the core curriculum. Might we be able to invert this entire system and take advantage of the fact that, according to the long tail, and I think this is true, this part of the long tail, I claim it is virtually impossible to find any kid who has an interest that there's not already a particular niche community of practice existing in the long tail. How do you find that? How do you join that? And how do you start learning from that? Again, all made possible by the net and by access to remote instrumentation. So let's think about this stepping back a moment. What's the opportunity to think about? We may now be at the moment of a perfect storm, the brewing perfect storm of opportunity. Think about, for example, open courseware in MIT, which is basically content, or the open education resource movement, which is now spread around the world. There's probably 1,000 universities engaged in the open, even the open courseware consortium, in terms of universities now putting up their courseware to be shared openly and to be remixed and repurposed for certain types of purposes. But that is content. If you believe in learning to be, you got to go beyond content. I want to suggest that we now have already, as a part of our scientific infrastructure or our scholarship infrastructure, all kinds of examples that I've gone through a little bit with e-science, e-humanities, and now sprinkle on top of that the philosophy of Web 2.0 in terms of participatory engagements. How might it be possible, very much like the NSFNET did, to be able to start to tie all this together in a form of an open participatory learning infrastructure where we actually bring for the first time content, activities, and tools all together, tying that together in this new type of infrastructure, if you wish, thus creating, if you wish, a new kind of ecosystem for deeply intertwining knowledge creation, learning, and mentoring. Think about the mentoring back in terms of the Folks telescope. Mentoring was simply just happening. Knowledge creation was happening, and learning was happening. How do you mix those together in deep ways? And that, through that mixing, through that intertwining, you really begin to understand more about learning to be, that then sets the passion to do things which gets you stuck. And when you get stuck, then you start wanting to know about more about, learning about. So let me end with a suggestion. We all know in today's net age that what we're finding in industry after industry, that we're moving from a supply push notion to a demand pull. Consider Amazon. How has Amazon completely disrupted the game in terms of moving from physical stores to their online shopping, which they can afford to hold one book that turns once during a year, and they can still make money from that. They're obviously a major mechanism for serving the long tail, but they're the beautiful example of demand pull. Of course, the media is another example of demand pull through the blogging, et cetera, et cetera. Advertising Consider how Google has transformed the advertising markets through AdSense and AdWords. And of course, starting originally with manufacturing, think about the whole notion of lean-based manufacturing, where we got rid of the kind of inventory-based schemes. Why do I bring this up? The question I have, and I think all of us face in a way that our technologies in this room made possible, is there a grand transition in the process of happening or about to happen in terms of this push to pull, supply push to demand pull in education? The 20th century may have been characterized by building stocks of knowledge as opposed to thinking about supporting the flow of knowledge. In building stocks of knowledge, we build up an inventory of skills in a student with the belief, authority-based belief, by the way, that you learn all this stuff and maybe 5 years from now, 6 years from now, you would get to use this stuff, as if the world is going to stay stable that long, but that's another point. But our entire 20th century model is really based on a factory model of education. Let's face it. The question now is, can we move more to another form in terms of kind of, you might call it learning ecologies, that are made now possible by tying together content, OER, e-science, e-humanities, Web 2.0, et cetera. Does this kind of open up a new form of informal learning, which may now enable us to revisit constructivist learning kind of in the most powerful way, but in terms of now joining and partaking in virtual communities of practice, where we are learning by tinkering, designing, creating, remixing, and researching. I want to argue that what we now may have is the ability to unite both the cognitive and social basis of learning and reconceive Dewey in the net age. When that happens, I want to suggest something else sets the stage here. Think about when recreation becomes recreation and remix. That is happening, in fact, although our school systems don't particularly acknowledge it. You find today the kids want to engage in this notion of recreation, remix, mashups, and so on and so forth. Think what this means in terms of creating a culture of learning, a culture that actually thrives on participatory learning, created by tinkering and inquiry, all made possible, guess what, by the net. Let me just say that it's the net, a tool for passion, a passion for rekindling our inspiration and our passion for learning. Thank you.
So there's time for some. So I don't know if any of you have suggestions, questions, brickbats, whatever. I know John would love to interact with you. There's a mic here, so if have questions so that the remote people can hear the questions, please go to the mic.
This is more of a comment, but it supports what you're saying. It's about learning by tinkering, and that can have big consequences. Gary Bahula and Mark Luker and I and a couple of other people did a demonstration of the network and tinkering for a senior citizen who was interested in learning, and the thing that was most interesting was a haptic feedback mechanism with a glove where he was touching a remote dummy. And a light bulb went off in this gentleman's head, and a couple of weeks later the FCC announced $50 million initiative on remote telehealth, and when the awards came out a week ago, it was $500 million almost, and this was Commissioner Copps. He wanted to know what the network was about, and I think that glove and the tinkering was it.
Very, very good. In fact, if you looked at the USA Today this morning, they had also an example for senior citizens using the Wii with the, actually with the MEMS-based accelerometers in order to get a sense of motion. And in fact, I have a very strong belief that the digital age has a bimodal effect. It has today's kids and today's senior citizens. Both of these lives are being transformed by this and is now beginning to encroach in the baby boomer generation in interesting ways. Yep. Yeah.
I'm an organizer for the Federal Consortium on Virtual Worlds, and we're starting to explore how virtual worlds can be used in education in the immersive kind of environment. In fact, one of the major interests in that group is education. How do you think about virtual worlds in terms of the schema, and are you experimenting with it at all, or using different kinds of examples?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I'm a big advocate of the virtual worlds. In fact, helped pull together the meeting with NSF and the MacArthur Foundation and Hewitt Foundation and Mellon Foundation and Kauffman Foundation last week that all want to come together to see how to really accelerate what you can start to do with the virtual worlds. And virtual worlds and immersive worlds are very interesting kind of issues, especially in terms of visualization. But I think the other thing to recognize is much of what we're trying to do, as these examples show, is to ask how can the virtual augment the physical, not just replace the physical. Because it is the augmentation that I think actually keeps kids grounded. And from there, you can go into pure virtual as well. Yep. Oh, dear. Go ahead.
Mike Nelson with Georgetown University.
I call him Mr. Trouble.
Incredible talk, John. But one thing I wanted to explore a little bit more is how what you're talking about, tinkering and apprenticeship, ties into the other huge change we're seeing in education today, which is the movement to online lectures, online courses. A lot of those courses are structured in much the same way courses have been structured for 50 or 100 years. Lectures, problem sets, tests. Do you see the online learning movement moving into this new world as well? Is there a way to do cognitive apprenticeships in an online environment?
Yeah, I think one of the, and you see this, by the way, more outside the United States and inside the United States right now, both in Australia and England, the Open University, UK, is the recognition that we can have our cake and eat it. And that is to say, we can put the content out there, even videos of lectures, but you try to feed them into study groups. And Jim Gibbons at Stanford did a beautiful kind of set of experiments on this, where basically you send a videotape of the lecture into a study group of like 6 kids. By kids, I mean, these can be college students or graduate students. And the deal is set up so that every 3 minutes or so, somebody stops the tape and asks if there are any questions. And in fact, you want to know the single most robust result in education research today is the best indicator to success in college is, do you know how to form and join study groups? We learn with and from each other. We construct our understandings through conversation usually, or through collaborative doing of stuff. And so this all starts to fit together in very powerful ways. And the whole point of one of my last slides is how do we tie all these things together? So content is still incredibly important. In fact, kind of the interesting question is how do you scaffold content up here in the long tail with more of these passion-based niche communities down here? And how do you get the hybrid actually flowing? Yeah.
Hi.
Pete.
Peter Denning from Naval Postgraduate School. I just wanted to second a little bit of your comment about around 1980 and tinkering, and then bring that forward to the present time. Around 1980, the National Science Foundation was in a larger question about how to help the computer science research community become more experimental. And the CSNet was actually part of their effort to help promote that. And the ACM Executive Committee, which I was the leader of at the time, decided to take a position in support of experimental computer science. And we wrote up a position paper and showed it around to a few people for review. And we kept getting back comments, don't equate it with tinkering. You can't equate it with tinkering. It will die if you use the word tinkering or even allow the idea of tinkering. So we had to be very careful in crafting our statement so that people wouldn't get turned off by the word tinkering. So that was really a strong force at that time. We couldn't even use the word without getting into trouble. And we come forward today, and you look in computer science education, where we're all struggling to get more students interested. There are some groups who are trying to do what you're talking about without the net. They call it problem-based learning. They call it project-based learning. There's a school in Salt Lake City called Newmont University that specializes in project-based unit learning. The students love it, but they are like outcasts in the education community. They're seen as outliers. People don't really want to take them seriously. They find all sorts of reasons to resist this sort of thing. So we still have a long way to go before we get this as a central idea in education, although each and every one of us learned what we know about networking and et cetera through tinkering.
Especially everyone in this room, my guess is. I think, by the way, that the, if you really want to transform the educational system, sometimes you don't do it by attacking the core, you build the edge. And let me suggest that I think we're going to find new ways to reinvent the role of the community library as a new type of safe social tinkering space that actually sets the stage for productive inquiry at the same time. A whole new use for reference librarians in that case. So I think we're going to find ways to build up the edge, and when the core begins to see what the edge is doing, that maybe is always, I claim it's the only way to ever transform the core. So I think that, I think we're going to be on this battle for some time, but I think it's going to be won. I think we have, again, by using ways to augment the physical with the virtual. And it's very interesting, one brief comment to me, because I spent a great deal of my time in Singapore, to find out that we in America are absolutely dedicated to mimicking the Singaporean system, which they rejected about 4 years ago. And anytime I go over there, I actually work with the Minister of Education, he says, John, how come America doesn't get it? Basically, we realize that you cannot train kids for the 21st century in terms of those drill and practice exercises. So Singapore has a mantra. The mantra is, in fact, teach less, learn more. More and more, full inquiry method, which is one form of the project stuff you're talking about, is becoming the dominant form of education. And I think when people begin to see Singapore take this on as a kind of a national goal, that may actually get our Department of Education to kind of step back and say, hey, maybe we're following the wrong goal here.
Greg Marks, Michigan Virtual University, and my focus is K-12 education, online education. And the constraints one runs into are basically the industrial model is winning. All those content expectations that every state sets up. In Michigan, we just set a whole new set of graduation requirements for students, includes online learning, includes a full set of 4 years of mathematics, science, but it's cranked out in a way that even when you build a course, and for example, as a lovely piece of tinkering, I recommend looking at a company called Explore Learning, and their piece is called Gizmos. They have about 400 little manipulables that you really explore what's going on. It's great stuff.
You can find that on the web.
You have to cram so many items into a course that a student actually ends up with no time to really explore and tinker with those. The flow of this, it's as though OSI has won. It's as though all the official standards bodies have won. What on earth can we do about this?
Again, what's so interesting to me with Singapore is this notion of taking very seriously, teach less, learn more. I can show you some very interesting schools, inner city schools, for example, in Providence, that are completely willing to accept the testing, the standardized testing. They spend exactly 1 week before the exam training their students how to take the test, that's all. And everything else is done more in the spirit of what I'm talking about. And these kids are outperforming any of the other schools in the inner city part of Providence. So we may have just fallen into believing that, in fact, if we have to get kids to pass these tests, as we do, that the only way to do it is to accept the catechism. It may not be true. And I can begin to show you some very interesting examples that these kids can pick up amazing amounts of things when they actually get engaged. And so, although I agree that the standardized tests, blah, 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 have obviously major problems, we may have succumbed to thinking that the only way to prepare kids for these tests is to do the kind of teaching you're talking about. I do not believe that logically follows. Yep.
I'm George Brett with Internet 2. Wanted to reflect on your tinkering in O'Reilly, the publisher, who
Right.
we know very well as, computing instruction manuals and whatnot. I think in the last 2 to 3 years, have engaged and supported, you might say, the amateur, which you spoke about earlier, and it makes me reflect back to Nesbitt's, one of his earliest books, of the high touch with the high tech. And now what we're seeing are the maker fairs and the craft magazine, and the readers and the subscribers of the blogs and their online materials, as well as the physical materials, are, this younger generation that we have. And this is really, I think, an incredible intermingling of, hacking in the right way, but creating new things with PC boards, or, and I've seen a number of people here too, is going back to some of the old crafts of knitting and whatnot, but actually applying, if you will, fractals and other mathematics in their craft. So just to sort of add to your gecko foot, the other thing.
I think it's a tremendously good example, and I mean, the make movement on the West Coast has really taken hold. In Menlo Park, there's something called, John, you probably know this, called the Tech Shop, which is actually build a community center of virtually every machine you can think of to build something with, all computer controlled and so on. That's kind of a part of the make type movement. And I don't know about you, but I was shocked at the last make fair. I figured when I went there would be maybe 600 kids. 40,000 showed up to participate. There is a passion here, very much like the passion that was in this room 25, 30 years ago to create the NSNet. And I think that our problem is that we got to figure out, how to let that crystallize. And it is happening in small pieces right now. And it comes back to the whole notion of the history of the NSFNet, when you started to wire together all the individual local nets. What we're looking at now is there a way to intertwine all these small movements to start to create mass and scale from this type of thing that will start to address some of the problems that were talked about over here earlier. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You need this?
Yeah, but I'll pick up I'm here all day, so it's okay. Yeah.
So I've let this go a little long. We're going to have to move right into our next panel if we're going to stay close to schedule here. So if the folks from the next panel will come up, we'll get right started. I don't think we could have had a better start for today. Thank you very much.